Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the latest of the Global CCS Institute's CCS talks, focused on issues related to accelerating the deployment of carbon capture and storage. I'm Jeff Erickson. I'm a general manager at the Global CCS Institute. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but like many of the rest of you, I've been working out of my house for the last 3 months. That's where I come from today as we speak. The topic for today's CCS talks is the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, Alberta's newest carbon solution. In June, the project was declared operational, making the Northwest Redwater refinery and the nutrient fertilizer plant the 20th and 21st large-scale facilities that were added to our database. Today, we have representatives of 4 organizations that were fundamental to the development of the project, and we're looking forward to hearing from each of them. A bit of housekeeping and instruction before we start. You should be able to adjust the view on the webinar by using the toolbox at the toolbar rather at the top of your screen. If you're not able to see that, you may need to come out of full screen view. You can focus just on the presentation. You can view the speaker. You can view all of the panelists, and you can take a screenshot at any time during the webinar. We will be recording the webinar, and it will be available over the next few days on our website for viewing by colleagues or others. You can submit questions throughout the webinar, and we'll be responding to them at the end. To do so, use the question box on your control panel. So before we start, just a few words of introduction to the Global CCS Institute. We're an international think tank. Our mission is to accelerate the deployment of CCS as a critical element of the climate change solution. We're backed by governments, businesses, and NGOs. We currently have 76 members around the world, and those members represent governments, multinational corporations, small technology providers, research organizations, and many others. We are based in Melbourne, Australia, and we have 6 locations throughout the world where we have staff. In addition to Melbourne, we have staff in Tokyo, Beijing, Brussels, London, and in Washington, D.C. There are 3 types of activities that we put forward. The first is advocacy, advocating with various stakeholders for policy and business initiatives to accelerate deployment of carbon capture and storage. We also develop knowledge and build the intelligence of stakeholders about carbon capture and storage. And the third thing that we do is we foster connections across the CCS, climate, and energy communities. So I'm really pleased to have with us today representatives from 4 of the 5 principal participants in the project. And folks, if you can turn on your webcams, that would be great at this point. Blair Eddy is the Chief Operating Officer of Enhance Energy. Jeff Pearson is the President of Wolf Carbon Solutions. Alyssa Honholder is the Vice President of Government and Stakeholder Relations for Northwest Refining, and Justin Wheeler is the Executive Director of the Climate Implementation and Compliance in the Policy Division at the Government of Alberta's Environment and Parks Ministry. So we're going to start with a bit of an overview of the project and the history of the project. Then we'll move into talking about current operations, some of the challenges that the parties faced and got past, and then a bit of a look ahead. So Blair, I will ask you to start with a bit about Enhance Energy, and then walk us through an overview of the project, including the key elements.
Sure thing. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for attending today. Thought I'd start a bit about Enhance Energy. We started this concept probably a little over 15 years ago. And it really was started by the chairman of Enhance Energy and the chairman of Northwest Upgrading. The same gentleman, Ian McGregor, had this vision to build an upgrader in the province of Alberta, build a refinery, and he knew that pipelines and CO2, were going to be an issue. And having been involved in the Weyburn CO2 project in the background, getting that project off the ground, he enlisted a few of us from the Weyburn CO2 project back in mid 2000. I started in about 2008 with the company to really build a capture pipeline and EOR system in the province of Alberta. And so, we've been at this for 15 or so years, and it's really been quite interesting to see it come from a concept through to fruition here recently. We founded the system back in 2006-07. Really, we backed our way into an agreement on supplying CO2, acquiring a joint venture arrangement with the Clive field with a company called Fairborn at the time to earn in a partnership to do CO2 EOR there. And then, as things evolved and changed with the concern around carbon capture and climate change, we've expanded the project to really be kind of the hub or the start of the transportation system in the province. We're based out of Calgary. We've got a team of roughly 20 people here, several of them with experience from the Weyburn CO2 project. And really our goal is to produce carbon neutral or net zero carbon energy. We can produce oil that has a carbon footprint of 0 and potentially even negative throughout its lifespan. And so, we've had lots of experience doing these projects in Weyburn, and we rolled it into Alberta here to be able to design and construct this large scale project. So if you want to go to the next slide, just a quick overview of the system, and it really consists of what I'd consider 3 main parts. So the capture of the supply area up in the heartland, what we call the Alberta Industrial Heartland, just north of Edmonton. That was a hub that was set aside for industrial development and for the refining capacity for the province to be put there. And so we really targeted that area because we felt that's where we'd find, the most pure, easily captured CO2 sources. And that's how we landed up with the Northwest Refining CO2 contract as well as the Nutrien CO2 contract. We needed to get it to kind of the right size the field, and so we chose a field where we could get an ownership in, where we could actually get a commercial arrangement that was, call it the right scale for the amount of CO2 that we had under contract. And that's how we ended up with the Clive field. It was a fully unitized field and major ownership by one party, so it allowed us to work in and back into that arrangement. The pipeline snakes through central Alberta, which really is the hub for what I'd call lots of EOR opportunity, as well as it's tied in tightly to lots of the CO2 sources that exist. If we flip to the next slide. So overall, here's our system partners, and they've all been part of this project here for the last 15 years. Nutrien signed on with the CO2 supply agreement, and they deliver about 800 tons a day or 300,000 tons a year of CO2 into the system. Northwest Refining, newly built system that Alyssa will provide more color on, but they have the ability to provide us 35 to 4,400 tons a day of CO2, so up to 1.6 million tons a year. The compression system and transportation system built and operated by Wolf Carbon Solutions, and really it consists of compression, dehydration, and a 240-kilometer pipeline down to central Alberta to the Clive field. And we're at the very end of it, taking CO2 for enhanced oil recovery and storage, and have the ability to handle more than 2 million tons a year of CO2 with the fields that we have under our control today. And the other major project partners throughout this, obviously, are the province of Alberta with their CCS fund support, as well as the government, the federal government, Natural Resources Canada, also assisted throughout this project development.
Great, so let me put you on pause there for a minute, Blair, and go over to Alyssa. Blair mentioned the Redwater refinery. Alyssa, that was a ground-up refinery, first approved for construction in 2007. talk about a bit more about the drivers for the refinery and how and if carbon capture was envisioned originally as part of the refinery design.
Sure, absolutely. Carbon capture was a huge part of the driving force behind the refinery. But before I go into that, I probably should just clarify one thing. So I work for Northwest Refining, which was previously Northwest Upgrading, and we're the founders and 50% owners of the Sturgeon refinery, but we're not the operators of the refinery. So just to clarify, I will definitely speak to you on how this all started and where we went. And as the first refinery to be built in Canada since the early 80s, we basically had an opportunity to design this thing however we wanted, and we could start with a blank slate. The vision of our founders was really simple. They wanted to refine Alberta oil sands and make low carbon fuels. So the only question they had to ask was, how do you take a carbon intensive idea and create a low carbon solution? And they applied what they knew. We live in Alberta, which is home to the world's third largest proven reserves of heavy oil. Energy development has been and always will be a critical to our prosperity for both our province and our country. And we believed that a carbon management strategy, without a carbon management strategy, our economy could be at risk. So we also looked at where global demand was going, and we thought that lower carbon fuels were the demand for lower carbon fuels was only going to increase. And if we could build something to meet the demand, we would have a competitive and sustainable advantage. So as Blair mentioned, our founders had a small portion of the Weyburn CO2 project, and that experience was critical in how they thought about design. They really, really wanted to create a refinery that could produce a pure stream of CO2 so that it could be cost effectively captured. And really, as Blair mentioned, that's just how the story goes. As the refinery project came to life, so too enhanced energy was born. And the technical opportunity for CO2 EOR was very evident. Alberta's home to some of the best geological deposits for storing CO2, and we had a wealth of knowledge on every single one of them. But without a significant quantity of CO2, nothing was going to happen. So all that was missing was an ability to connect all the pieces. So the refinery, the ACTL system, the EOR business, we're all so intertwined that we don't really work without the other. So our entire story started as a made in Alberta systematic approach to energy development and CO2 management, not just as a refinery with carbon capture.
So as before I go back to Blair, it sounds like all the players involved early on were committed to or convinced that a low carbon future was the future. And that seems to be a bit, you were either ahead of the pack or kind of pushing against the conventional wisdom back in the mid 2000s. Is that the case? Were the players in this, and Blair, I'd like to get your comments on this as well, were the early players in this project kind of swimming upstream, if you will, and had to convince both your internal and your external stakeholders that this was the way to go? Why don't you start with that, and then we'll go to Blair.
Sure, I definitely think it was a very bold and risky approach. Definitely hasn't been an easy journey at all. And I'll pull an awful quote, but I think it's so fitting. It's a Ricky Bobby quote: "If you're not first, you're last." And we had visionary thinkers that really were ahead of the curve and really wanted to try something. And luckily, they had a history of success in their entrepreneurial careers that, I mean, just as the refinery alone, we were able to go out on this idea and raise close to $500 million in capital in a very short order of time and get our regulatory approvals ready to go within 2 years. So I think all the right pieces ended up in the right place to push some bold ideas.
Great, thanks. And Blair, talk about those early days from Enhance's perspective. Same question. And then also, when you finish with that, let's talk about the nutrient fertilizer plant as well.
Okay, well, I do agree with Alyssa. It was definitely a bold move at the time. And I think what allowed our leaders to take that move was they seen the success of the Weyburn CO2 project. And they seen that, you know, you could capture man-made CO2 cost effectively, you could transport it to where you needed it, and you could make, really create value out of what people viewed as a waste commodity. And so they were emboldened with that opportunity. And yeah, we definitely swam upstream. We swam upstream a lot of different ways. A lot of the companies at the time had the idea that, these emitters should pay us to take the CO2 and put it away. we kind of split that ground and said, no, there's got to be a commercial arrangement that wins, that's a win for everybody. And so, we structured some type of commercial arrangement that allowed the emitters to capture some value, but also allowed Enhance to create value with that CO2.
Great, thanks. And talking too about the fertilizer plant and how that came into the project.
Yeah, so the fertilizer plant, that plant's been in operation for 30 plus years, fairly consistent CO2 supply. And, we needed to have a critical mass of CO2, and Northwest Refining, happened to locate themselves directly across the road from the Nutrien Redwater fertilizer complex. So it was a substantial amount of CO2, not nearly as big as the Northwest Refining volume, but it was something that existed today. It was a wet stream that could be captured. It was very pure, but it was wet. And Nutrien was a willing party to make a commercial arrangement to have their CO2 captured. Being that it was a process emission, they weren't under a lot of pressure to do that, but they felt it was the right thing to do, and they were willing to make a good commercial deal for that to happen. So that's how we kind of pulled that CO2 supply in, which then gave us, under contract about 5,000 tons a day of CO2, which, is enough to really make a commercial EOR business mature. So.
Great. And then you wanted to also, if you would, talk about the multiple priorities that ACTL is still doing.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I think we got into the CCS side of it, and we had some success with the 2008 climate fund that the provincial government put out there. I think one of the reasons we had success with the project and we're actually able to get funding to support it was the fact that we're accessing oil that would never be recovered otherwise. So that was oil that was essentially stranded in the province, would never be produced without something like CO2 enhanced oil recovery. We're able to create a lot of jobs because we're investing, $50 to $100 million a year for the next 10, 15 years to support the development of the EOR with the CO2 supply we had. Accessing that oil is providing royalties back to the province, back to the citizens of Canada and Alberta that support their healthcare, support their education systems, and generate wealth for the country. And it was given us, as Alyssa mentioned, we sit on some very good geology for CO2 enhanced oil recovery and CO2 storage, and it was giving us the ability to learn how to maximize that and open the door to be able to store megatons of CO2 within the province of Alberta.
Very good, thank you. So I want to turn to Jeff Pearson now from Wolf Midstream. Jeff, Wolf's a fairly recent addition to the project, became a project partner in 2018. Just tell us a little bit about Wolf Midstream and then what the decision process was for Wolf to get involved, and what did you see as the promising business opportunity there?
Sure, thanks, Jeff. So Wolf is a infrastructure investment company based in Calgary, Alberta, and founders have got significant experience in developing oil and gas facilities and pipelines, and founded in 2015. And we've raised a significant amount of capital, or equity capital, from one of the world's largest institutional investors, and we've invested about $3.5 billion to date. So it's not a small company, and the partners were looking for opportunities to either acquire or develop new infrastructure and leverage off the skills that we have. And so when looking at the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line opportunity, there was a relationship there with some of the existing individuals, and we saw three things I think we really liked in the deal. The first was an opportunity. We were able to structure it and create an opportunity to invest a significant quantum of capital in a structure that had an appropriate balance of risk and return. So it met the economic hurdles with respect to that. We also saw Alberta as a great place for doing carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I think Alberta's got a number of significant emitters. Justin will talk a little bit about Alberta's emissions. We've got, as Blair touched on, we've got very suitable geology. We're in a large sedimentary basin for being able to store the CO2. We've got a long history of skills, or a large number of people that have the skills in oil and gas development, which is pretty amenable to EOR, obviously, and sequestration, and the required equipment for that. And then we've also got carbon price and a long established regulatory framework in Alberta. So when looking at a place to do this, we thought Alberta was a great place. And then I guess we'd had the fortune of coming in 2018, and the ESG side of the equation was really starting to take off at that point as well. So saw all those and thought this was a great opportunity.
Great. So let's turn to Justin Miller from the government of Alberta. And Justin, in 2009, the government signed a funding agreement for nearly $500 million. Pretty substantial and a real enabler to allow this project to go forward. Talk a bit about the government of Alberta's interest and investment. What was the motivation, and what are you seeing as the benefits across a range of benefits to the province and its people?
Sure, thanks, Jeff. So maybe I'll start with just a little bit of context, and it was alluded to a little bit by my co-panelist. In terms of emissions, Alberta is a very large share of the country's emissions, and that is because of the resources that we have. Both Alyssa and Blair spoke to the oil and gas resources. Alberta has the majority of Canada's oil and gas resources and the majority of the associated industrial development, both in the extraction industries as well as the industrial manufacturing. So we make up about 37% of the country's emissions currently, and that percentage has been relatively stable over the last 2 decades. And then when you look at Alberta's emissions breakdown, we're quite unique within Canada and even within the world, where about half of our emissions is from the oil and gas industry, from the various sectors there. Another third is other heavy industries, electricity and industrial manufacturing. And then you're really just left with about a quarter of our emissions from what people typically see as the main challenge for climate change of vehicles and buildings and agriculture sector. So Alberta is quite uniquely placed in the structure of our emissions. And because of that, a lot of these emissions are coming from emissions intensive, trade exposed industries that are competing globally. They're not setting their own prices for their commodities. So Alberta has always been conscious of the challenge and of the spotlight that's put on Alberta because of the scale of our emissions, but also conscious of the interlinkage between our economy and our emissions, and the need to find a pathway forward that balances both the need for economic resiliency as well as progress on climate change. So Alberta's actually been taking the climate change issue seriously for decades. Under Premier Ralph Klein in 1998 was the first cabinet subpanel specific to climate change. So this commitment to invest a significant amount of money in CCS came out of our 2008 climate change strategy, which was built on kind of those generations of research and exploration of what the potential solutions are to the greenhouse gas emissions challenge in the province. So the strategy itself was informed by several key efforts from multi-stakeholder groups since the late 90s, early 2000s. So we had a carbon dioxide capture and storage technology roadmap. We had an eco-energy carbon capture and storage task force, and an Alberta Carbon Capture and Storage Development Council, all very active in the late 90s, early 2000s, looking at this issue. And really CCS is one of the key solutions for the province because we have that geology that's suitable for injecting the CO2, and we have those large point source emissions that don't have a lot of alternatives. So there's of course other things we can do with energy efficiency, which was another key plank of the strategy, but to get the deep reductions that we need to move the world where it needs to go, we need CCS as part of the solution. And to wait for it to happen organically would be a long wait, and we would find ourselves at the technology taker side of the equation as opposed to the technology maker side of the equation. So in 2008, the government, similar to Alyssa's comments about and Blair's comments about their companies making bold commitments and bets on the technology because of the vision for the future, it was really the same thing for the province. there was a recognition of this issue and its significance to the world and its significance to Alberta's economy, both as a strategic issue and as a moral issue. And the government knew that it had to take some bold action, and CCS, it was quite obvious based on the previous work that had been done in the province that CCS needed to be a key plank of that action, and that it wasn't going to happen on its own, or it would take a much longer time to happen on its own. So the government committed to funding up to $2 billion worth of commercial scale integrated CCS projects. And this was at a time when most people looking at CCS were looking at kind of lab scale, bench scale research projects, not commercial scale, fully integrated delivery. So that bold commitment really was able to attract a number of interesting proposals, and in the end, we started with a long list of 51 proposals. We whittled that down to 4. We went into negotiations. Of course, 2008, 2009 was the financial crash, so it was a significantly challenging time, both for government budgets and corporate financial markets. But we weathered that, and we came out with 2 commercial scale projects, $1.24 billion of commitment. And for the global audience, keep in mind this is a subnational commitment, not a national government. So we're punching on the scale of global countries in terms of our investment and our commitment to these projects. In terms of the principles, really why we put public dollars into this is because this is such a key technology for the province's economy going forward, and because of the spillover. The first demonstration of these full-scale technologies is going to create a lot of knowledge that everyone else in the province and the world will benefit from. So there's that justification of kind of correcting the market failure of a spillover when you're investing in technology. So that knowledge sharing piece was really a key part of it, and the proving the technology, so making sure that there's very strong measurement, monitoring, verification requirements is also a key part of the funding arrangements. So the parameters of the funding was up to 75% of total incremental CCS costs. So we're not paying for the brand new refinery that the Lissa's company was building. We're paying for the incremental costs associated with the CCS. It was a stage-gated process, so structured process to whittle down to the top proposals. There were 4 projects that went all the way through to the negotiation stage, and then 2 of those fell off, partly due to the crashes in natural gas prices and the significant gains in renewable prices that kind of undercut the economics for being able to invest in CCS at a coal-fired power plant or in situ coal gasification in the province. So the 2 that we were left with were in our oil and gas industry. And then we structured those as long-term contracts. So the payments are based on milestones. There's a financial security requirement from the companies. There's financial audits. So we really tried to, like Jeff talked about, create that balance between risk and due diligence, making sure that we were not throwing away public dollars, but we're responsibly investing in something that will pay dividends for the province for years to come.
Right. So definitely, you mentioned the knowledge sharing reports, and go a bit deeper on that and talk more about what the requirement was and what's included in those knowledge sharing reports. Sure.
So the knowledge sharing is a key part of the funding agreement. So there's reporting that's required on a number of fronts. So each project is required to report on its capture performance, its storage performance, the monitoring, measuring, and verification, both the structuring of the actual monitoring and as well as the results of that MMV process. They're required to report on their stakeholder engagement and their costs and revenues, which is a key thing because, as we all know, everybody's frantically trying to figure out, what's the path to net zero, what's the path to Paris, and how much is that going to cost? So being able to have real on-the-ground projects that are being built and then reporting on those real costs is a key piece of information to help inform Alberta's and the world's strategies for decarbonization going forward. So all of those reports are required as part of the contract and linked to the payment milestones in the grant agreements, and then they're published on the Government of Alberta's website. So the the link is up there, and I think we'll post a live one in the comments for people that want to click on it. So anyone at any time can go and read the results and benefit from that investment. And the reason the government of Alberta does that is because we are investing significant dollars, and we don't want just 2 projects. We want, we have a 273 megaton challenge, and we have lots more projects. We have lots of extra capacity in the pipeline, which we're going to talk about. We have lots of other good low-hanging fruit that could be captured. So getting that knowledge sharing information out there will help accelerate the next investments in carbon capture and storage and decarbonization.
Great, thank you. And Justin mentioned that link will be available in the chat box. I have read through the summary report this week, which is 60-some pages, and there's an astounding amount of information. It's almost a how-to manual on how to build one of these projects. So some great information, not just on the technical aspects of it and the operational aspects of it, but also the economics are also addressed there. So I would encourage you to have a look through there. And that was the summary report, and there was plenty of information for me. And then there's a detailed report as well that supplements that. So just a great resource that's available to the world that the government of Alberta and the principals in this project are providing. Great, thanks for that, Justin. Let's turn now a bit to some more of the operational issues, and I want to start with Alyssa to talk about how the CCS equipment at the refinery integrates and what that looks like.
Sure. So as the first bitumen refinery to incorporate gasification with carbon capture, we really didn't have a playbook or a design to copy. So as the only non-engineer on this panel, I'm just going to apologize to all the engineers and explain it in the way that makes the most sense to me. The operation was premised initially on 2 very simple considerations: what we wanted as inputs into the refinery and what we wanted as outputs. We needed to be able to handle heavy oil sands bitumen as an input, and we really wanted to create low carbon fuels as the output. So we designed the facility to be an upgrader and a refinery in one, meaning we could take the low value, heaviest feedstock in the province and turn it into the highest value finished product. It's unique because in most cases, usually bitumen goes to an upgrader, gets upgraded to a lighter crude, it removes the sulfur, removes the heavy metals, and then it's sent to a refinery to process to clean fuels. We made a decision to design the refinery and configure our technology in a way that we could achieve all of that in one facility. The other really important output we wanted was the pure stream of CO2 that we've talked about. So we used proven technology, but we configured it in a, I guess I would say, a unique made in Alberta configuration. It was designed to maximize hydrogen addition and to remove carbon content. It wasn't anything revolutionary. It just hadn't been configured in the way we did it. So we used key commercial technologies: hydrocracking, hydrotreating, and gasification. The gasification unit is sort of the heart of the refinery. It's where all the good stuff happens, and it's where we capture our carbon. We chose it because refining bitumen is really hydrogen intensive, and gasification is what allows us to take that heaviest portion of the barrel, the stuff that's usually a waste product of bitumen, and turn it into the hydrogen we need for the rest of the refining operation. The byproduct of that, of course, is a significant quantity of pure CO2. We then use Rectisol, which the way I understand it is the solvent capture process that separates pure CO2 from the gas streams in the gasifier. And we then capture about 3,500 tons a day, 1.3 million tons a year of CO2 instead of venting it into the atmosphere. It's then compressed, sent into the ACTL system, and sent down to Blair's project in Clive. By doing that, it eliminates 70% of our total CO2 footprint and provides us a pathway to one of the lowest carbon intensity diesels available from any complex oil refinery.
Great, thank you. So 70%, why did you settle on 70%? Was that kind of optimizing the economics, or was there another driver there?
Well, I mean, really, we capture all the CO2 out of the gasifier, and that represents about 70% of the total refinery footprint. So we're doing everything we can from an environmental perspective to keep that carbon footprint as low as possible. But at this stage, that's all we're able to capture. Right.
Okay. Got it. Thank you. And there's a couple of other photos There's a photo of
That's
the
the
gas
gas
fire that's
fire.
just coming up now. Yep.
I like to call it the heart of the refinery.
And then do you want to talk about the compression as well?
You know what? I'm going to leave that to Wolf. I'll leave that to Jeff.
Okay, Jeff, over to you to pick up on compression and pipeline.
Thanks, Jeff. So within the refinery itself, actually, the CO2 comes off of the rectisol unit, as Alyssa discussed, and we own a booster compressor within the refinery. And so we take that atmospheric dry CO2, compress it up to a interstage pressure. We built a 24-inch pipeline from within the refinery, within that gasification unit, that goes around the edge of the refinery, and it ends up at another compression station, which is the picture you see on the screen here. And this site is just directly due south of the refinery. And at this site, we've just got a large integrally geared compressor that takes that CO2 from its intermediate pressure and compresses it up to our pipeline pressure, which is up to 2,600 psi. So everything we're doing is in a dense phase from a CO2 perspective. And this is because, again, the CO2 we're getting in this situation is dry. We've just got large coolers here. It's all air cooled. We don't have, it's really just a large compressor station. And so that then goes into the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. And you can see those two pipelines. Actually, we'll just flip to this. I'll talk about it after, but just go back one slide, Ben, if you don't mind. So this facility right here is our other facility. This is a construction photo of that facility, but you can see it's a lot larger facility from a footprint perspective. And this takes the CO2 from Nutrien. And as Blair mentioned, Nutrien's providing us a wet CO2. So it's a CO2 directly off of their hydrogen manufacturing process as part of their ammonia production process. So they make ammonia and urea at that facility. And we get a saturated CO2 product that's about 2/3 water and 1/3 CO2, and it's at 90+ degrees Celsius. So it's prior to this facility, it was actually going up their stack. So it's essentially a gas product that goes up the stack. And so we built a 36-inch pipeline that takes that CO2 from within their facility, and actually that pipeline is a little over 1 kilometer long, but it runs downhill into our facility. And because again, there's a significant amount of water, and we cool it, we remove the water, we compress it, we dehydrate it, and then we refrigerate it and we liquefy it. So it's a pretty complex process driven by the water handling requirements and just the smaller volume of CO2. And that's all done, again, maybe we can flip to the next slide. Because, and you see the pipelines here, that Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, but we're running the ACTL system at, it's a carbon steel pipeline. So we're running it at a very dry spec. So we need to dehydrate down to a really low water content. And then the pipeline itself is 12-inch at the north end, 16-inch at the south part, runs 240 kilometers down to Clive. Blair showed that diagram before. And we've got on that pipeline, we're running it at up to 2,600 pounds in a dense phase. We've got block valves every 15 kilometers or so to isolate the pipeline in the event of a rupture. So it's an interesting pipeline. We'll talk more about it. It's right now we've got no pumping along the pipe, so we put the CO2 in at the north end and pull it out, deliver it to enhance at the south end, and there's no interstage pumping. And we'd be able to, we're doing about 1.4 to 1.6 million tons per annum, 1.6 we'll call it, and the pipeline can do about 14.6 million tons per annum. So we're only using a very small capacity of that pipeline, and with additional looping and pump stations, we could get up to a much more significant volume. And I'll hand it over to Blair.
Yeah, Blair, before you talk about the far end of the pipeline in EOR, just pick up on Jeff's comment about the 1.6 versus the 14.6 million tons a year of capacity. Why are you at 1.6 now? Why is the pipe built for 14.6, and how do you get from here to there?
I'll maybe jump in on this one. So that was part of how we applied to get the CCS funding, is we were looking at building a system that could do more than just our project alone. And when we were scoping this back in 2008, 2009, that heartland area with the proposed refining and upgrading that was going to be up in that area, it was looking like there's a potential for, 40 to maybe 50,000 tons a year of CO2 available there. And so when we kind of back calculated what we wanted to do for line size, we wanted to be able to at least take the majority of that CO2 if it showed up there, and allow the system to grow. And, so unfortunately, a lot of those projects have been shelved over the past number of years, but that's why the capacity is what it is today. And part of the reason that, you kind of look at the route and you wonder why it's as windy as it is, back then also there was a few sources that were kind of on the east side of the province that were potentially being developed. One was a Sherritt project off on by a toll field there that was going to be, potentially 10 to 15,000 tons a day. So we kind of tried to route the line at the time to potential CO2 projects, but also to what I would call the heart of the EOR and storage aspects of Alberta.
Okay. And I'd like to come back to that in a minute, but before we go there, let's talk then a little bit about the like I said, the far end of the pipeline, the EOR process.
Okay, so the EOR, CO2 enhanced oil recovery isn't a new process. This stuff's been going on since the 70s in Texas, in West Texas, where they took reservoir CO2 and used it to recover oil out of their fields in West Texas. So they've been injecting it for 50 plus years now. As I mentioned earlier, we get to turn what is a waste product, what people consider really a bad product, CO2, into a value-added commodity by mobilizing oil that would never move otherwise, revitalizing old reservoirs in the province, and really extending the life of these fields by 20, 30, 40 years, capturing another 10 to 30% of the oil in place. And so, it's a fairly simple process. I'd say in Alberta, we've had, and in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, we've had a lot of experience with injecting fluids into reservoirs. We've injected water, we've injected acid gas, we've got disposal systems. We really understand the geology. We know how to inject, we know how to monitor and track where that product is going into the reservoir. And just to also highlight on one thing that Justin mentioned, the funding that Enhance Energy received as part of this was strictly against the CO2 system. It wasn't anything to do with the enhanced oil recovery aspect. So it was to support the development of the injection wells and the injection pipelines. It wasn't for the oil production facilities. It wasn't for the oil production wells. And so that's kind of how the project was split to meet the needs of the CCS requirement. So we move to the next slide. Really, Clive, it's as I said, we had to right size it for the volume of CO2 we have here. And you can see that we're planning to develop this in multiple phases, 3 phases over a period of 3 to 5 years. And really that pace of development is strictly dependent on the amount of CO2 we get out of our supply. And so, based on what we're seeing today from Northwest and Nutrien, we're thinking that we're going to have this field developed fully in about a 5-year window. And you can see that we've really redeveloped the field from a perspective of using horizontal CO2 injection wells with offsetting horizontal production wells in a pattern basis. And these horizontal wells are roughly about somewhere between 1,200 to 1,600 meters long, depending on the area of the field. And we redeployed the systems that we could. We reused a lot of the old facilities in the battery. But when it came to the flow lines and things like that, we had to upgrade the flow lines to meet the requirements of the CO2 as well as the CO2 production. But the unique thing is we're actually able to reuse a significant amount of existing surface leases to drill the new horizontal wells on. And the existing well bores that are there, they're also incorporated into our overall plan for measurement, monitoring, verification. They're one of the tools we use to make sure and demonstrate that we are keeping the CO2 in the formation that we're intending it to stay in. So we flip to the next slide, just a quick overview of the battery, an overview from this winter here. It's probably around January, February. And you can see, there's a lot of construction activity kind of on the bottom half of the page, and all the stuff around the top, the existing tanks, existing treaters. We repurposed some existing slug catchers and free water knockouts. We're able to repurpose a lot of equipment and then add new equipment as needed to handle the CO2 injection as well as the CO2 production as it came back into the facility. And on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see a right-of-way coming into the battery. That's actually the ACTL line coming from Fort Saskatchewan all the way down to Clive, and it terminates just on the top right corner, just to the left of that flare stack. You can see the termination point there.
Thanks, Barry. What strikes me from this photo actually is that, this is not just a matter of an injection well or a series of injection wells. There's a significant amount of kit to make this all work together. And at the same time, if you can see the trucks in the foreground, it's not a big footprint. The area that's covered obviously is many times more than the actual footprint above ground. And I think that's fairly typical of EOR fields and EOR injections.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Great, thank you. Let's move forward to challenges. We have about 10 minutes before we turn to Q&A, so I want to see if we can keep the responses and the questions, for that matter, really brief. This project was 13 years from inception to operation. Justin, let's start with you. Why did it take so long, and what was the government's involvement and investment? Would you consider it more of an accelerator or a brake on progress?
Yeah, good question, Jeff. I think we've talked a lot about the complexity of the projects and just the number of players involved and the scale and the newness of it. So I think those were all key drivers of how long it took. There's been a significant amount of change over that time too. We're on our 6th provincial premier now since the time that the original $2 billion commitment was made. That being said, I mean, it's hard to imagine almost $500 million being anything but an accelerator, and it's a significant amount of money. Certainly, if conditions were right and oil prices were super high and maybe the carbon price was super high and the private capital was flowing, and all the regulations and everything were in place, like if you took that alternate reality and somebody had the private capital to just fully fund the project, probably they could have moved quicker, but that wasn't the reality. We didn't have any commercial scale CCS happening. We didn't have EOR happening at this scale. We had some small EOR fields happening, and we were developing the first brand new refinery along with this project in North America for years, and a complex refinery with some state-of-the-art configurations of technology at that. So there were a number of reasons why it took a while. And from the government's perspective, when as a public servant, when I'm stewarding hundreds of millions of dollars of funds, I'm going to be careful with that, and we're going to stage gate it, and we're going to be careful in our project selection and our due diligence and all those things. So certainly there were probably times when Blair was cursing us behind the scenes for taking a while with some of those due diligence steps, but that's a necessary part of being a partner in a project of this scale. But this wasn't the only thing happening at the time. In parallel to negotiating these agreements, we were doing a full regulatory framework assessment. We were passing new legislation, new regulations. We were implementing our carbon pricing system, which was the first one in North America. We were establishing the rules for emissions offset credits and accounting, and making sure that the incentives were in place in the CO2 pricing system that would further support this development. So it was really a whole bunch of complex, multi-pronged policy initiatives and stakeholder negotiating initiatives that all had to happen in parallel. Certainly the next one will be faster. You know, the reason why we're excited about this project and my co-panelists are excited about this project, as we've mentioned before, is it is overbuilt for the current scale of capture. So now we can capture another 13 million tons without having to build a new pipeline. And we can build those in an industrial heartland that has all the regulatory framework set up and has a carbon pricing system set up. So really now we can honestly go to the world and say, you want to build a net zero facility, Alberta is the place to do it. We're competitive on every front of attracting investment, and that's a very relevant thing to be able to say now. So it took a lot of bold foresight and a lot of groundbreaking over the last decade plus to make that happen, but it's a pretty exciting place to be now, I think.
Yeah, great, very well said. Reactions from the operators on either the role of the government of Alberta or the federal government for that matter, or any other things that really made it difficult to accelerate or to move forward with the entire process.
I guess, you know, I would say that really fundamentally it all boils down to being able to have a secure, adequate CO2 supply. And so CO2 supply timing really was the driver behind this. And yeah, there was a lot of things, a lot of, call it roadblocks in the way to get there, but fundamentally without Northwest Refining being there to be able to provide that 4,000 or 3,500 tons a day of CO2, there was not an economically viable project without those guys there. And, you know, Alyssa can allude to some of the challenges they had, and, you know, it's tough building a project in the best of times, but when you go through, you know, 08, 09 economic collapse, you know, 2014 oil price crashing, as Justin alluded to, multiple premier changes over time, you know, you don't have that certainty of supply. And so really, we couldn't have been here any sooner without Northwest being there sooner. So, you know, having lived, you know, one of these projects in the past, having been involved with the Weyburn CO2 project from the start, it takes a lot of years to pull all these components together. And, you know, we got here. I wrote down on my board, our first day of injection was 4,157 days after I started at Enhance. So just a short period of time. But, you know, I think, you know, the key is having the right amount of CO2 to be able to make something economic. And I think, you know, everything moved in that direction, and we got there. And I'm, you know, quite excited about what exists today, because there is huge opportunity in this province to expand CO2 capture and EOR and create a tremendous value for Alberta and Canada. So.
Yeah, and it strikes me in the language that you've been using today, Blair, that you see CO2 is a resource, not a waste. Exactly. So that's a great shift in the way we're thinking about CO2. Alyssa or Jeff, do you want to address issues, whether it's schedule or other challenges that you faced in the development going forward? Jeff, you look like you're ready to jump.
I think we had the fortune of joining the project after Enhance had done a lot of the heavy design lifting, and so we encountered the typical weather delays and challenging construction conditions, but all in all, I think it was a pretty efficient project for us.
What about the challenges from the refinery? What might have been done differently?
We had every possible challenge that you could imagine. We had challenges in the early stages, we had challenges through construction, we had challenges at commercial ops and everything. But I think the one thing that Justin touched on and then everyone sort of alluded to is these projects don't happen unless you can have a strong partnership between government and with industry. And I think the strength of this project is that we had a great partnership there. Yes, there was tons of change over of the players through the years, and we started from square one every time there was a change. But at the end of the day, we also knew that it didn't matter who was in government and what they were focused on from an ideological standpoint. The end goal of these projects were going to achieve the same thing. And we had a huge amount of support in a stakeholder base that represented Albertans. We were supplying jobs. We were supplying an opportunity to create new revenue streams into communities. We were doing things that mattered to the people. And we were very, very lucky to be able to get through every single one of the challenges that we faced because we had a very strong system of support behind us.
Sounds like a great project to be involved in. Thanks, Alyssa. Blair, I know you've got a couple of slides here to address your view, Enhance's view of the way forward. And we're coming up on the top of the hour, so I wanted to jump into Q&A quickly, but if you could just say a few words, perhaps quickly bump through those slides on what you're seeing as the future of a low carbon economy.
Sure. If you want to pull up the slides there. So, as I mentioned, net zero oil is something that we can achieve doing CO2 enhanced oil recovery. And that's something that's definitely evolved over the last number of years as carbon pricing has become stronger. Oil pricing, has been soft, but there is a huge opportunity here in Alberta to produce a net zero oil out of these reservoirs. We'll end up storing more CO2 in that reservoir than those barrels of oils that we produce would ever emit. And so, I think we're sitting in a really unique spot in Alberta, and the sector is moving to low carbon platforms. We're trying to decarbonize our transportation fuels and all our energy sources as much as we can. And I think this is a key to that. And I think there's definitely some focus on it now. It's not just windmills and solar panels that are going to get us there. People are realizing that it's projects like carbon capture and storage and utilization and EOR that will help move us to a low carbon future. And so I think that's an exciting part of it. If you want to move to the next slide, this just really highlights, as Justin talked about earlier, there is a lot of emissions in Alberta. We're anchored in a really key spot to help solve some of these problems. But I think you also, and Alyssa mentioned this as well, we have a good partnership with the government. They've got some good regulatory systems in place that allow the development of these EOR and storage facilities. We've got pore space ownership that's been legislated, and there's really good public acceptance for this project overall. When we were routing the pipeline through, we ran into one landowner that initially said, no way, I don't want another pipeline on my land, go away. We left a packet of material. They called us a few days later and said, this is a great thing. We need to do this. Come across our land, put the pipe in. So there's acceptance in Alberta for this type of activity, and they see the benefit to both Alberta and to Canada. And so, we've had the ability to develop that leadership and experience around carbon capture, storage, and utilization. So I think we're sitting on a great spot. And I think, as I mentioned, the capture, the amount of CO2 is certainty, and that'll move it forward. And there is future technologies that are being developed, and that's great. But I think we're in the realm today where existing technologies can be deployed economically and at scale to allow this stuff to accelerate forward. We don't have to wait for the Eureka breakthrough. It exists today, and we need to scale up on it. And so that's where we feel, we're quite excited by what's been moving in the CO2 capture world, and we think that gap is definitely closed, and there should be more technology. The existing technology should be deployed to capture more CO2. And I think the key to it all is this is really the bridge to our low carbon. We get to achieve all these things by doing what this project has pulled together. We get the zero carbon, low carbon energy development. We get to be a key place for investment by being able to provide a low carbon hub for industry. We get to put people to work, doing both EOR, carbon capture, supporting other industry. And it's really the bridge to, I mentioned earlier, our ability to store gigatons of CO2 in Alberta. So, we think we're quite excited, obviously, by it, but we think there's a bright future for Alberta in this.
Great, thanks for that, Blair. Two things that just jumped out at me from your comments. One is certainty, how important certainty is in so many different aspects for investors in carbon capture. And the other thing you said is this project is storing more CO2 than the oil produced will emit. And that, I think, is a misnomer that a lot of folks have about CCS projects. It's important to realize that actually carbon negative oil is within reach and based on existing technologies. I want to move now to question and answer. So Patricia has been gathering the questions that have come in from the attendants. And Patricia, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Yeah, sounds great. And we've got a ton of questions. I apologize if we can't get to all of them, but thank you so much for your interactivity here. So there have been a lot of questions kind of around the pipeline. What's the cost per kilometer? Were you able to use any pipeline infrastructure? Are there thoughts of connecting this pipeline with other pipelines going into other provinces like Saskatchewan? So maybe if some of the panelists want to answer those group of questions.
Jeff, do you want to start with that?
Sure, I can take that. I think from just a cost basis, I think in our most recent pipeline cost, we report a cost of about $320 million or somewhere thereabouts for a 240 kilometer pipeline. So about $133,000 per kilometer is what we've seen. And this is all new pipelines. So we've looked at reusing existing pipes, but given the size we were looking for and where we were going to run this, we built a new system. We do continue to look for opportunities to use existing stuff given the costs and challenges of building new pipelines, but haven't seen anything yet there. And we've looked at building into Saskatchewan. It suggests the first places we're likely to build would be a pipeline down and directly into the Heartland area that Justin talked a little bit about, and Blair talked a little bit about, which is just south 20 kilometers of our existing, the start of our pipeline. And then the other area we're looking to build would be up into the oil sands with a goal to go capture CO2 up there.
Okay, great. Another area of questions we got was your thoughts on geological sequestration. So we talked a lot about EOR in this presentation and the opportunity there. Have you looked at places where you could do geological sequestration instead of EOR? There were certainly some questions around the economics of EOR given current oil prices. So maybe some thoughts around that.
Yeah, maybe I can jump into that again as well. And Justin, one of the other project Justin referred to that received funds from the government was the Shell Quest project, where they're doing geological sequestration into a saline aquifer, a deep saline aquifer, in proximity to the start of our pipeline. And we've looked at that as well. I think it provides a long-term option for storage, but we still believe that EOR as well, as Blair talked about, it being a resource rather than a waste product. EOR should still carry economics for a long period of time.
Yeah, I'll just maybe jump in on that a bit as well. I mean, sequestration, there is tremendous opportunity for pure sequestration in the province, but fundamentally, I would say we're CO2 short right now on an EOR basis. And even with these weaker oil prices, you know, the economics of CO2 or EOR are still stronger than pure sequestration. Right now, there's still that gap on pure sequestration that, you know, it's gotten smaller, but it's still a gap, and EOR bridges that gap. So, you know, I see in the future there's potential for more pure sequestration, but I think that's many years out because Alberta is sitting on 50 plus years of EOR opportunity today. So I think it's there, but I think EOR will still continue to trump that.
Maybe I'll just add in if I can, Jeff. So from the province's perspective, we take a portfolio approach to emissions reductions in general and CCUS. So we have, as Jeff mentioned, we have the two commercial scale projects. One is a pure sequestration, one is an EOR. So between the two of them, we're approaching 3 million tons a year, 2.75. We've also invested significantly in other forms of utilization. So one of our partners, Emissions Reduction Alberta, ran a grand challenge on CO2 utilization, a $35 million funding round to support the development of new CO2 utilization technologies. And the two top ones, one of them is for using CO2 in concrete, another is for using CO2 in other consumer products. So it's not an either or in our point of view. It's setting the conditions to enable all pathways to reductions, both through our pricing system and through our our portfolio of funding programs that support innovation, and then let the private partners and the other partners emerge and advance their own technologies. And in the end, it's going to be a mix of the solutions that help pave the path to our broader emissions commitments.
Great. Another question, and that kind of followed up to some of the things that Blair was talking about, the economics. So there were a lot of questions about the economics. You know, a lot of our audience members are from the United States. Obviously 45Q and LCFS are kind of very important ways about how projects get funded there. They were asking for maybe a little bit more information about how do these become economically viable. Is, you know, enhance paying for the CO2 and essentially paying the refinery and paying a pipeline tariff, and is that supplemented with government funds? A little bit about how that's working, and maybe if there's exchange of money among the parties, as much as you can share.
So yeah, yes, there is exchange of money among the parties. Yes, we do pay a toll. That's part of our agreement with Wolf to help finance this overall project. We pay a toll based on, it's really a function of a couple aspects, which is really a credit sharing agreement, as well as a commodity charge based on some type of sliding scale tied to oil pricing. So it's not much different than the kind of the tolls or the CO2 costs that you would see in West Texas. You know, it's in that same order of magnitude that, you know, all in you're looking at, you know, typically two times WTI, you know, for CO2 costs. And it's just a per MCF, but it's yeah, it depends on the party, depends on the arrangement. Some people value credits more than they value the commodity charge, and so they're structured that way. And the economics, you know, they're still economic, but fundamentally, you know, LCFS, we don't have that here in Canada yet. We do have the province has, federally, there's a carbon pricing regime in play, which helps, especially being that these projects are so capitally intensive up front, that those definitely help early time with development. But fundamentally, it's the oil revenue that the oil sales that pay for this whole structure today. And so the little old Clive pool at the end has got a big weight on its shoulders to pay it all down. So.
Patricia, can I just jump in with a follow-up question for folks? I'm not sure who this should be addressed to, but you know, the question always comes back to us at the Institute is, what's the cost per ton to store CO2? And so I'll put that out to you guys. What's the all-in cost, either capital and operating costs over the anticipated life of the project? I know that we've overbuilt the pipeline, if there's a way that you can account for that, but you know, is there a number that y'all refer to as your price per ton of CO2 captured and stored?
So there is some information as part of the knowledge sharing reports. There's a cost per ton methodology that reflects that, and I'm trying to remember the exact number because I haven't looked at it in a while. But I think if you look at the overall ACTL project and the system we have in place, with the, you know, the reality of the small volumes we have in a big system today, I think last time I looked, we were looking at less than $100 a ton. I want to say it was in the 90s, 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. But there's a lot of factors that go into that, but that's an all-in number today. So it's a competitive number. It can be driven lower, I think, as we build more sources. The tolls go down. That helps drive that per unit cost down. And the more capture we build, the cheaper that capture becomes as well. So.
Another question we had was about community engagement. These are obviously big projects. How did you interact with, say, environmental NGOs or labor groups or other interested parties who may have had opinions on this project throughout its life cycle?
Listen, I know you have a couple of things. All right, listen, over to you. Thanks.
I can speak for the refinery perspective of this. We fully embraced the opportunity to have those conversations. We were very eager to hear what people had to say. We knew we were building an asset that was going to last generations, and we wanted to be part of the community. So the only way we knew how to do that was to engage with those that were impacted and really try to understand how we could fit in. And so we took a very serious approach to that and spent a lot of time trying to build those relationships, address concerns, and adjust our path accordingly.
Yeah, I think I'll just echo what Alyssa said there as well. We, Enhance did the same thing in regards to, getting the pipeline and EOR system built. We actively engaged all the parties in proximity and even stretching outside the normal proximities for the development of the project and the pipeline. And it was an effort that never stopped, even though the project was stalled out for many years. We kept those relationships open. We kept the landowners notified. We kept them up to date as to how the project was progressing. And we have great relationships today with the landowners and the people along the pipeline route, and we intend on maintaining those moving ahead.
I would also add to that, many of our stakeholders became our ambassadors. Like we probably were able to carry the message of what we're doing stronger from those that maybe started as opponents, because now they were benefiting from this project, and they saw an opportunity to find alignment and synergies. So we've created an entire province full of ambassadors.
Great. Well, I
just,
think
Justin, you want to add something there?
Yeah, just quickly from the broader public perspective, multi-stakeholder engagement has been fundamental to our climate policy development over the last number of decades, and that's right from the nitty-gritty to the regulatory framework assessments and the project approvals all have kind of established multi-stakeholder processes, as well as the more general climate change strategy updates and consultations have all involved significant public engagement. And I would echo that this project and CCS as being part of the solution has had fairly strong support throughout. I think, the one durable area of question that we probably get is, why are you spending so much on these expensive things when there's cheaper things you could be doing? And our response to that is that it's not an either or, it's a both. We have our carbon pricing system and other incentives to drive the low cost reductions, but to get to the long-term trajectory, we're going to need some of the more expensive things like CCS too. So we can't afford to just wait on those, on CCS and other more expensive solutions.
All right, well, great. I think that this is going to end our question and answer session. I know that there were many questions we didn't get to, and we apologize for that, but certainly thank you for your interaction.
Great, thanks, Patricia, and thanks to the panelists. Just a comment on Justin's point about cheaper solutions. One of the tidbits I picked up in the knowledge sharing report is that the government of Alberta expects $15 billion in royalties over the next 30 years as a result of this project. That probably assumes 14 million tons a year full build out, but still that income is certainly substantial and places the business case of projects like this, not just for the project owners, but also for the governments that are involved. And this is a way to wrap up. Thanks, first of all, to all of the panelists. Great insights. And again, I would encourage folks, if you were interested in more details, to have a look at the knowledge sharing report that's available to the public. There are, we continue to conduct these CCS talks on an ongoing basis. The next event will be on the 23rd of July, and that's going to be talking about the Carbonate project, which is a project in Australia. And you can register through our website. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and will be available for folks probably in the next several days, also on our website. And if you do have any questions related to the Institute or about ACTL, certainly feel free to speak with Patricia or myself or anybody else from the Institute. Hope to see you all on the webinar on the 23rd of July. Until then, please stay safe, please stay healthy. And I really appreciate the involvement from everyone, including both the panelists and the participants. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.